today is part of a larger chapter of my dissertation. This paper speaks more to what's happening at the local level in North Carolina with free people of color. So the rest of my dissertation chapter talks more about the union effort that free people of color contributed to. And I won't be talking about that today, but if you have any questions about that, maybe I can answer. The historiography of free people of color in the South, with a few exceptions, is silent on the influence of the Civil War in the lives of free non-whites. Yet the Civil War era was the most important point of change for free people of color in North Carolina. The most significant debates over their social and political position took place during this time. At the onset of the war, state lawmakers stripped the right to bear arms from free people of color, prevented them from employing slaves, and began to impress them in the services of the Confederacy. For the first time, North Carolina imposed forced labor on significant numbers of free people of color. Before this time, jurors typically ignored many of the laws prescribing forced labor for free people of color found guilty of crimes. However, during the war, they imposed forced labor even on those not convicted of crimes. These edicts suggested to free people of color that North Carolina law no longer would protect their rights to life, liberty, and property. As a diverse population with various opinions about slavery, secession, and simply how to survive, free people of color responded in a variety of ways to the major changes in their society. Most free people of color quietly supported the Union cause or stayed neutral, which were easy choices since North Carolina law banned them from membership in state regiments. The majority proceeded with their pre-war daily activities and continued to interact regularly with their pro-Confederate white neighbors. A few free people of color, many whose appearances could not distinguish them from white men, illegally joined the Confederate Army. However, most of North Carolina's free men of color who served during the war fought for the Union. They battled those who challenged their basic civil liberties and attempted to place them on an equal footing with slaves. Although the political interest of many free people of color and enslaved people united as the Civil War progressed, the diversity of ways free people of color reacted to and participated in the Civil War demonstrates how different their position continued to be in comparison to enslaved people. Though some whites sought to interject additional prohibitions into the lives of free people of color during the war, free people of color ultimately continued to maintain a status closer to white freedom than enslavement. When free people of color made decisions during the war years, they took the maintenance of the freedoms that they already possessed into consideration. On the other hand, slaves sought a freedom that they did not have but wanted to realize by generally supporting Confederate defeat. Building on their argument that the liberties of free people of color jeopardized the maintenance of slavery, radical pro-slavery ideologues continued to attack the position of free people of color and called for increased limitations on their basic civil rights. Calmer voices held off full assaults on free people of color, including calls for their enslavement, but many free people of color found the actions of pro-slavery ideologues too grave to ignore. In the coming years, free people of color generally proceeded silently, but did not forget the hostilities of their neighbors. Some free people of color, for their own profit, or more likely for their own survival, continued to work side by side with their Confederate white neighbors. Others hoped for Union victory and the end of the radical pro-slavery regime. Obsessed with protecting slavery and preventing collusion between slaves and free people of color, radical pro-slavery ideologues enacted 2 laws explicitly limiting the civil rights of free people of color. 5 months before secession, the state legislature passed laws preventing them from keeping weapons and severely limiting their control of and interaction with slaves. The weapons law prohibited free people of color from keeping on their persons or in their homes shotguns, muskets, pistols, swords, sword canes, daggers, bowie knives, and powder or shot. Keeping one of these weapons was only a misdemeanor. However, the law explicitly stated that if found guilty, a free person of color would be fined no less than $50, a hefty penalty which for most would mean hiring out at public auction. The law limiting free people of color's control of slaves offered a similar fate and levied a $100 fine for each offense. This act prohibited free people of color from buying or hiring slaves and prevented slaves from working as apprentices to free people of color. Those free people of color who had slaves before the passage of the act could continue to own those slaves, but additional purchases were banned. These legislative acts reminded free people of color, and maybe even some concerned whites, of radical pro-slavery ideologues' willingness to compromise the liberties of the free in order to preserve and expand slavery. The new legislation drastically challenged the civil rights of free people of color, limited their access to certain types of private property, and denied them the right to bear arms, even in defense of their own homes. These laws charted the course of life for most free people of color under the Confederate regime. Free people of color remained unbound to slave masters in law, but in practice, pro-slavery ideologues had the right to impose themselves in the daily lives of free people of color. Under the guise of war effort, pro-slavery radicals now mandated significant restrictions on and power over the activities of free people of color. However, it is unclear whether North Carolinians more generally support these actions or to what extent local officials actually enforce the new laws. Local officials certainly failed to confiscate every weapon owned by a free person of color. While the political and social position of free people of color was at its lowest point just prior to and during the Civil War, the enemies of free people of color still failed to fully suppress the liberties of free people of color. Even in the midst of war, several bills restricting the rights of free people of color failed in the state legislature, and the laws that succeeded faced public protest. In 1863, the House Judicial Committee considered a bill to, quote, prevent slaves and free persons of color from having and owning dogs, which died in the legislature. The State Assembly also saw a bill to enslave all the state's free people of color convicted of crimes, a more rigid piece of legislation requiring the removal or enslavement of all free people of color passed in Arkansas, but all mass enslavement attempts failed in North Carolina. Even when discriminatory legislation passed in the General Assembly, radical pro-slavery ideologues still encountered challenges from their more moderate constituents. After the passage of legislation limiting the rights of free people of color in early 1861, 15 white justices of the county court of Hertford County, most of whom were wealthy and heavily involved in local politics, petitioned the legislature in protest of the weapons ban. They requested a, quote, modification of the ban that would allow county courts to decide who among the free persons of color should or should not be allowed to carry weapons. The petitioners argued that, quote, a just discrimination among applicants and the grant of such favor to deserving persons is itself a strong incentive to persons of this class to maintain a good character and deport themselves properly, end quote. These men recognized that stripping additional rights from free people of color only made them more likely to rebel against the political system. As free people of color began to feel increasingly powerless and grew to understand that the law treated them not only as second class, but as non-citizens, they were less likely to support other objectives of that law, including the protection of slavery. Although the most radical pro-slavery advocates despised free people of color, some officials understood that free people of color could play an important role in the Confederate war effort. With North Carolina's secession from the Union in the middle of 1861, county officials enlisted the aid of free people of color to help the secessionist cause. State law prohibited free people of color from enlisting in the military service as soldiers. Nevertheless, free people of color served both willingly and through coercion in other capacities. Throughout the war, county and Confederate officials called free people of color to work on a variety of military-related projects. At the beginning of the war, neither the state nor the Confederate government had concluded that laborers needed to be obtained through conscription, and white North Carolinians recruited free people of color to work for pay as laborers and cooks. In April 1861, before North Carolina officially left the Union, officials in Gates County offered, quote, all the free Negroes who shall volunteer to cook or do other service shall be paid, and if their families want any meat and bread, they shall be furnished, end quote. Offers like this one enticed at least a few free people of color desperate for work for the Confederates. Unlike enslaved people, free people of color were financially responsible for themselves and their families. North Carolina's secession and changes in the state's commercial alliances pulled free people of color into the Confederate economy. Some free people of color who owned their own businesses or farms had to participate in that economy, but did not necessarily have to work overtly under the direction of the Confederate forces. Those with few financial opportunities had less of a choice. Such was the case of E.P. Reed, John Reed, and Fletcher Smith of Gates County, who county officials removed from their apprenticeships in October 1861 to work on the fortifications on Long Island. In September 1861, 2 crews of free men of color from Orange County, totaling 16 men, received pay from the state for working on Beacon Island. During July 1862, Thomas, Peter, and George Clark all filed claims for work done under the commissary at Gettysburg. The men only received $10 per month for their labor, but for some, this pay undoubtedly was better than no allowance. By 1862, some Confederate officials were no longer willing to let free people of color decide whether they wanted to apply their labor to the Confederate effort. In April 1862, Fayetteville Observer reported that, quote, "It is difficult to procure free colored men as servants and cooks," end quote. The paper's source for the story suggested that, quote, "The convention give us authority to impress them into the service with responsible pay," end quote. In several parts of the state, officials began the mass conscription of free people of color into the government service. In December 1862, Cumberland County officials, with instructions from the Confederate commander in Wilmington, ordered, quote, "all free Negroes between the ages of 16 and 50 years inclusive, except blacksmiths, pilots on boats running from Fayetteville and Wilmington, 1 barber for each shop, shoemakers and harness makers to work the fortifications in Wilmington." 10 months later, Cumberland County officials issued a comparable order requiring free men of color to work Cumberland County's fortifications. Similar impressments took place in other parts of the state. Solomon Oxendine of Robinson County recalled that Confederate officials arrested him and sent him to help construct the breastworks at Fort Fisher. Other free men of color from Robinson County also served at Fort Fisher. The conscription of free people of color into the Confederate service strengthened the state's manpower for the war, but the removal of able-bodied men from the home front could create serious problems for people simply trying to survive. In August 1861, this potentially was the case for Jeremiah Day, a free man of color from Orange County. With the support of 4 white men, Day complained to the governor that Captain Miller, commander of the Confederate unit, wanted to take away Day's 2 nephews, Sterling and Leonidas Day. He explained that the Confederate Army had already taken 5 of his sons, and at age 70 years, he and his wife would become destitute and dependent of the county if Captain Miller took the 2 boys. The impressments of free people of color also threatened the livelihoods of white families who depended on free laborers of color. On May 5th, 1864, Delia Wilder of Wake County, a white woman, petitioned Confederate Secretary of War James A. Sutton to protect Bryant Morgan, a free man of color, from possible impressment. With her husband in the Army, her eldest son dead, and left with an elderly mother, a, quote, very infirm enslaved woman, and 8 small children, Wilder employed Morgan as a field laborer on her farm. Wilder's representative explained that if Morgan is taken away from her, quote, taken away from her by the government, that it will be with great difficulty for her to carry on her farm and support herself and her family. Even during the divisive times of the Civil War, the lives of free people of color and their white neighbors continued to be indelibly intertwined. As before the war, free people of color were essential participants in local economies. Now that the Confederate government had removed thousands of white men from their communities to the battlefields, the importance of free non-white laborers at home only increased. As the war dragged on, Confederate officials not only became more insistent that free men of color work for the Confederate cause, but also decided that expanding the participation of free non-whites in the war effort called for a reduction in the benefits free people of color could receive for their service. In Chowan County, local officials rescinded their offer to provide for the families of free men of color serving the Confederacy. In February 1862, the officials ordered that, quote, hereafter no orders for provisions be given to families of free Negroes in the service of the state, end quote. This order allowed Confederate officials to divert increasingly limited provisions to the families of white Confederate troops. The lack of volunteer participation in the war suggests that most free people of color were uninterested in directly supporting the Confederate effort. When white Confederates finally attempted to force free men of color from their homes, many resisted or attempted to escape. The October 16, 1861 issue of the Raleigh Register reported that in Wilkes County, a quote, free Negro, only referred to as Fletcher, fled from a group of white men who sought to impress him as a servant in the army. Fletcher ran from the men, but was, quote, pursued and caught. Cornered, Fletcher pulled a pistol and killed one of the men. After killing the pursuer, the surviving men hauled Fletcher to the jail in Wilkesboro. In Wilkesboro, an, quote, excited crowd gathered around the jail, removed Fletcher, and proceeded to hang him. Since direct resistance was often dangerous, some free people of color simply sought to evade imprisonment. Isaac Griffin of Pasquotank County avoided forced labor by staying away from home anytime the Confederates were near, and recalled years later that he, quote, had to leave home several times to keep from being carried off by the rebels. George James and Richard Bray, all free men of color from Haywood County, attempted to evade impressment by arguing that someone else owned their services. In September 1864, each man responded to their recruitments by claiming that they had deeded their labor to James R. Love for 99 years and could not be taken from his service. Some free people of color avoided impressments but still had to deal with trouble from the rebel army at home. During the war, the rebels twice confiscated property from John A. Chavers, a fairly well-to-do free man of color from Wilkes County. Chavers claimed that in 1863, the Confederates took several hundred pounds of bacon and corn without providing payment. Near the close of the war in 1865, rebel forces again visited Chavers and took away his clothing, watch, money, and bed clothing. Isaiah Simmons, a free man of color from Fayetteville, faced harassment from members of the local rebel Home Guard. In 1863, the Home Guard arrested Simmons and detained him for a day for allegedly providing, quote, information to Confederate reserves. Towards the end of the war, Confederate soldiers picked up Simmons for being a, quote, damn Union rascal. They attempted to hold Simmons, but he made a successful escape during the middle of the night. Although most free people of color were less than willing supporters of the Confederacy, a minority of free people of color placed their stakes with the rebels. Their cooperation with the Confederates demonstrates the diversity of opinions among free people of color about survival strategy, secession, political loyalties, and Confederate social policy. An undetermined number of free people of color from Robinson County supported the Confederacy by both offering money and provisions and volunteering for the Army. In 1862, Washington Lowry and Joseph Locklear donated one pair of socks each. Olin Hammonds contributed $3, and Farragut Chavis gave 3 pairs of socks to Colonel T.J. Morse's North Carolina Confederate Union. Confederate officials listed Henry Ruggles, Stephen Hammonds, and B.J. Chavis, all free men of color, among a roster of volunteers from Robinson County in 1861. Whether they actually saw battle is unclear. The law disqualified non-whites from serving as soldiers in the Confederate forces, and since these men volunteered for local units, the commanders of their outfits likely knew that they would not be able to employ these men as soldiers. Some free people of color discovered ways to get around the law and join the Confederate forces. Solomon Oxendine, a free man of color from Robinson County, explained that some of his cousins joined the Confederate Army by crossing into South Carolina to enlist. In South Carolina, officials did not know these men's history, which gave them a better chance of fighting without being protected. For those free men of color in other parts of North Carolina who desired to join the Confederate forces, officials in charge of enlistments appeared to have allowed certain men honorary white status. These free men of color joined regiments from their home counties, and certainly those who enlisted them knew that they were considered non-whites. In September 1861, Samuel Chavers, a free man of color from Orange County, volunteered for the rebel army and fought with the Confederate regiment in several battles until he was found to be partly of Negro descent. Discharged from the Army at the end of 1862 for this reason, Chambers later re-enlisted in the same regiment and continued to fight for the Confederacy until he met his death in May 1864 in Jericho Fort, Virginia. Several members of the Goins family, a free family of color from Moore County, also fought for the Confederacy. Henry, Andrew, Richard, and John W. Goins all served with the 35th North Carolina troops. In July 1862, Andrew Goins died during a battle outside of Richmond, Virginia, leaving a wife and children back in Moore County. Rachel Goins, Andrew's wife, successfully collected her husband's back pay. Although the Goinses were not white, Army and local government officials provided them with the same treatment as if they were any other Confederate military family. Free non-white North Carolinians who aided the Confederacy left no evidence to explain their motives for supporting a regime that could demonstrate public disdain for non-whites, both free and enslaved. Maybe their motives were similar to the rationale of the free people of color of New Orleans who offered their services to the secessionists. These men claimed that they offered themselves to the Confederates in hopes that their allegiance would convince the rebels to treat them as equals to whites. Some free people of color may have been motivated by individual allegiances to white friends and family members who served with the Confederates. Others may have saw publicly supporting the Confederacy as a means of gaining favor from rebel whites and removing suspicion that they might be secretly supporting Union victory. Likely, in some of the rarest cases, free people of color may have actually agreed with the radical pro-slavery secessionist propaganda, which labeled the North as the oppressor of the South. Maybe they, like so many of their white neighbors, believed that the Union was trying to impose its will and interfere with the South's peculiarities. Regardless of their motives, the free people of color who supported the Confederacy attempted to distinguish themselves from the majority of people of their status who did not support secession. Nevertheless, that action should not negate the intertwined interests of white supremacy, radical pro-slavery thought, and pro-slavery dollars as the major causes, goals, and assumption behind the Southern War for Independence. The state's secession from the Union interfered in the lives of all North Carolinians at one time or another, but many free people of color found ways to continue experiencing a semblance of their antebellum lives during the war years. As in the antebellum period, free people of color still played critical roles in agricultural production and helped to shape social life. Free people of color across the state continued to operate farms and do other kinds of work for their livelihood. Living in Harnett County during the war, Raleigh Seabury moved his family back and forth between Gainesboro and Smith's Ferry to farm rented land at the best price he could get. Seabury also worked as a cooper during this time. Exempt from the service on account of rheumatism, William H. Haythcott cultivated 20 acres of rented land in 1864. Free children of color continued to work apprenticeship assignments. Free people of color also continued to attend church with whites through the war. In June 1864, white members of the Meharry Baptist Church in Hertford County approved the enlistment of the establishment of a Sabbath school for children of free congregants of color. Free people of color found a variety of ways to survive the tumultuous years of war behind the Confederate lines. Continuing on with their daily lives was the primary strategy for most free people of color. However, some people of color responded to Confederate pressure through active resistance, while others conformed to local officials' demands. Through further legal restrictions, forced labor, and discriminatory pay for work, Confederate officials generally demonstrated to free people of color that the state needed them as a means to its goal of independence and had no intention of placing free people of color and whites on equal footing. Nevertheless, in a few cases, Confederate officials broke ranks with the general opinion and allowed free people of color to participate in the Confederate war effort side by side with whites as their peers. Most North Carolina officials agreed that the war with the Union was a battle for Southern independence and an endeavor for the protection of slavery, but whites never came to a clear consensus about the role free people of color should play in the effort.